Paul Sykes, the Lupset Lout, the wild man of Wakefield. There'll never be another, certainly from the Wakefield area, and I think the city of Wakefield will sigh a huge sigh of relief. You've all read the books by Warcry Publishing. One. And believe me, I've spoke to a lot of people over the years, and the words no doorman in the city of Wakefield ever wanted to hear was Sykes out. Even if it wouldn't resort in violence, it was always a case of he would turn up and take great pleasure in humiliating people. A lot of, because Paul, obviously he wasn't blessed with a great deal of patience. Even like when you'd be speaking to him and you weren't on his wavelength, he'd get irate and quickly, just surpass you. There was a few Wakefield doormen in the city, I suppose, were capable. You'd have to look at your Bob Tucketts, and your Les Cars, who were boxers and world champion karate guys. But other than that, he just was an absolute walking nightmare. In the years when he was in his prime, in the 70s and the 80s, to even when he was at his back end, although he couldn't fight, he would still be a nightmare, and although the fear of violence with him had gone, he would still turn up in pubs and try his luck and, try and intimidate people like he once could, but it didn't wash. There's a story in that book I did with Chris Campbell. He was a doorman in Wakefield, and he said he was speaking to a barmaid, and the fear, she gave an expression. Chris, I think, was the head doorman, and he would brief all his doormen and say, look, if so-and-so comes in, if Sykes comes in, don't let him in, because once we get him in, it's going to be a bigger problem getting out. So a barmaid shouted Chris, and he said to me, he said, I could tell, looking on her face, I knew what she was about to say. Sykes is already in. So now, I suppose Chris and the guys are going to really, really earn the money. So Chris, it was a nightclub. It's in the book anyway. I can't think off the top of my head. And basically, Paul Sykes has just sat there, not causing any trouble with his mate. He's just drinking. He's sending his mate to the bar every 10 minutes, pint after pint after pint. And Chris said to me, he said, it was like a boxer making his grand entrance. He said after a few pints, he got up and just basically walked to the dance floor and started shadowboxing. And he said, I've never seen a dance floor disappear so quick. So then obviously Chris, he can't just stand there. Him and his doorman are kind of fighting among themselves, and they're like, well, who's going to get him off? And, the team, some of them didn't really want to get him off. So he went up and tells, Sykes. It led to a bit of what's the word? Like a spaghetti standoff when there's Clint Eastwood. And I think it was because Chris stood up to him that, obviously Paul Sykes, I think this was about 1992, 1993, but Paul Sykes was a man used to getting his own way in life. And he certainly wasn't used to people standing up to him, particularly by someone smaller than him. And I think Chris basically just said to him, he said, listen, he said, you might beat me, but he said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a fight. And after a while, Chris, I think he kind of won his respect, because Sykes was taken back and he was like, I like you, I'm going to buy you a pint. And then, Chris sat down with him and he was telling him all his stories. But I have spoken to a lot of other doormen in that book. One comes to my mind. A Doorman in Rooftop Gardens, I think it was. I'm Mark. I'm very, very sorry, but I can't pronounce his name. It's said Zilaz or something like that. If you're watching, Mark, I'm really sorry, but you'll understand, because I imagine no one's going to get that. If you read the book and you see the book, it's about the word, the name is about 15 letters long. It seems Polish. Anyway, it was time to drink up, and this guy, this Mark. You know what I mean, don't you? Do you know what? Just to show you. If you can read that. It's at the top. It's 14 letters. Anyway, this guy, Mark, he was quite a good looking guy as well. Could handle himself, and he just went to where Paul Sykes and his gang was sat, and he said, "Right, lads, time to drink up now." And all Paul Sykes was kind of sat there with this group, He was like a school teacher talking to, because he would get that a lot of people would crowd around him, and basically the crowd just sat and looked at him and sniggered as if, "Are you going to actually try and tell Paul Sykes what to do?" Paul kind of looked back at him and he said, "You're a good looking lad." He said, "How long have you been doing this?" And he told him a few years or something. He said, "There's not a mark on you." He said, "Our lads, I better go." And but that's a different side to him. And I can promise you, I've spoken to a lot of Wakefield bouncers certainly a lot of old men around West Yorkshire who have got worse stories than that. And a lot of people in Wakefield would just, if they'd see him, they'd just, one bouncer said to me, he said, whenever he would come in, we'd get a bag ready, fill it up with about 20, 30 bottles and just give him it, just to go. So he was just, let's be honest, he wasn't always the drunk he was. You're talking about someone who, once upon a time, was... well, not even once upon a time. You're talking about a man who was 6'3.5". He would fight as a pro, 15.5, and he would put a lot of weight on. So you're talking about someone 18 stone at some point he was an athlete. He could really fight like the devil, and obviously he didn't suffer fools gladly. He lived by his own code, his own morals, and if you didn't fit into his plan, then violence was just something he could tap into at the drop of a hat. And there is a lot of stories. There's 5 books on him now. Paul did the first one. I've did 3. And War Cry Publishing have done that one. And it was, I just can't imagine what it would have been like if you did it in a club and he'd come in. Because I know I spoke to a lot of people who didn't even want the names in the book. And and stories I couldn't use, and they said, we just at times just had to let him do what he wanted, and it's almost like there's a 7-foot bear walking in your house. What do you do? And I think that was the case. And anyone watching this who's been around Wakefield or was in the pubs with him, then you'll be nodding your head when you. Listen, I'm not from Wakefield, but what I've done is I've went and I've sat and interviewed a lot of people, and the stories are always the same. That he was, any bouncer, whoever had Paul Sykes in the premises, really earned the wages that evening. But yeah, guys, all the books are now on Amazon. So if you click on the link here, all the links should be on. So that was the first one. Paul written that from 1985 to 88. That book is from March 77 to June 1979. And then obviously I wanted to know what happened to him. So I spoke to 50 people in there who kind of, it goes from the start of his life to, you've got his family members in there, and all kind of different people, well-known names and that. And that basically tells a picture of you know, that guy, who he was, to the not so flattering pictures in there. And then obviously there's The Further Agony, in my opinion, which is the best book by far. Most of the people from the Lupset estate are in prison with him, and yeah, I think that's the most accurate of who he was, because obviously with the clientele of people I got, Warcry Publishing produced that book, which I haven't, you know, I never written that one, but in my opinion, that's the best cover we've ever done. It just, unfortunately, it wasn't one of mine. And then The Last Word, you know, I mean, to be quite honest, you could read that before any of them, because that just basically tells us, that's, in my opinion, in my words, over 8 years of researching Paul Sykes from the cradle to the grave, and I put that in just under 200 pages. It's all my words, apart from a former detective sergeant, Wakefield police officer who's retired now. He asked me to keep him anonymous, but that chapter alone, I'm not just saying this because that chapter alone is 20 pages of a Wakefield police officer, and that chapter is the price for that book is worthy for just that chapter. It really is, because, you know, there's lots of people like me who could say, I didn't know him, I never met him. That's a police officer there who knew him when he was a monster to in the end of his days. So, you know, he's seen him when he had to go to his house and arrest him and think, right, I need to take half the shift at Wood Street Nick, 12 of your biggest lads, and Paul Sykes would just sit there, roll his sleeves up, and he'd see that as a direct threat. It's a bit like in the animal kingdom, you know, the gorillas, they're kind of, if you stare at them, you know, it's best to look at the floor. And Paul Sykes would love that, because he said to me in the book, the police officer, he said, sometimes I would plan a Sykesy arrest with military operation, and sometimes I used to send a 5-foot police officer, and that would kind of do the trick. So there was lots of different ways around it, but that officer, you know, has rolled around the floor with Paul Sykes. He's dragged him down corridors when there's been 12 of them, and also he's arrested him when, at the end of his life, which was very sad, when a gush of wind would have blew him over. So yeah, that's anyone who has ever worked on the doors of Wakefield in the 70s and the 80s, I'm sure you've probably got a book alone. If you you know, I spoke to people like your Chris Campbells and your Gavin Hepworths, and he was just a one-off. And I don't think there's been a lot of other characters from Wakefield as well, like your Paul Burks and your Colin Beaumonts, but the police officer in that book, he said, listen, he said, there was no one, there was kind of, they were like, just, he said, Sykesy was in a league of his own. And a lot of the times he said to me, I'm not giving the full book away, the last thing he said, a lot of the times when I've arrested the big criminals from Leeds, they would often be arrogant, and they would go up and say, do you know who I am? He said, Paul Sykes was never like that. He said, everyone knew who he was, and that was probably the most scariest thing. He said, you know, I've arrested all these he was telling me the names, which I'm not going to name. And he would sit and think, well, hang on a minute, if you're saying to me, do you know who I am? You can't be all that. He said that was never the case with Paul Sykes. Everyone knew who that man was. And, you know, I imagine, without a doubt, you know, I mean, it's funny because it's a shame some fabulous people spoke to me, but can't repeat what they said. But they said, you know, sometimes the Wakefield bouncers would count down. They'd be working on doors and they'd be thinking, Sykes out in 3 weeks' time, Sykes out in 2 weeks' time. And just whatever, you just knew, you know, even you could speak to him during the day and he'd be the most intellectual, polite gentleman you'd ever meet. And then 8 hours later, it's the same guy, but he's had 12 pints and you're dealing with the devil. So yeah, that's the character. That was the one-off. That was Paul Sykes. And I imagine he would have been, well, I've been told in double figures now by Wakefield bouncers. yeah, he was just a whirlwind of chaos. And I hope, well, obviously speaking to Western Edge Pictures the other week, my boss did, and the film is going to take off from 1989, so that will be Paul Sykes at 43, and that's when that documentary was. So yeah, that's where it's going to start off, and yeah, it's gonna take one incredibly gifted actor to pull that off, no doubt. So, right, guys, thank you so much for listening to my dribble, and thank you so much. God bless. Don't forget to subscribe.